Greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I have laryngitis, so my apologies in advance. I sort of wish I had this all the time because then I could be basso profundo and not baritone as I usually am. So I was recording this earlier when I was so rudely interrupted by a telephonic cable. So this is a video about Princess Michael of Kent, which someone requested. She's sometimes known by the unflattering sobriquet Princess Pushy. She was born Maria Christina von Reibnitz what is now the Czech Republic, but then it was the Sudetenland. It was part of the Third Reich. So her ethnicity is Austrian and Hungarian. I don't think she speaks Magyar, but she grew up speaking German, of course, largely in what's now Austria. Because about the Sudetenland, these people were ethnically Germans or ethnically Austrians, whatever you want to say, certainly German speaking people. People didn't always distinguish between Germans and Austrians in the old days. Her father was in the Wehrmacht and indeed was a member of the Nazi Party. Not that that reflects any discredit on her. She was an infant at the end of the Second World War. A lot of people were in the National Socialists. Now, we all know that the National Socialists committed abominable crimes. A lot of people joined it out of naivety, out of careerism, and so on. And then they were too deeply committed and they realized what was going on and were they going to leave. Very few people had the moral courage to do that. Anyway, so when she was a child, they moved to Australia. That's where she perfected her English. What was so wrong with Austria after the war? I suppose it was just recovering. And I don't know if she became an Australian citizen, but Australia had this populate or die policy in the 1950s. They still had a white Australia policy, this racist attitude of banning non-white immigration, but welcoming whites from just about anywhere. So when she was 18, Maria Christina von Reibnitz, as she then was, moved to London. And the Victoria and Albert Museum, they had some sort of fine art course. And she enrolled on that one. I don't think it was degree bearing. And then she became an interior designer. So she said she grew up speaking French, but her French is not that good, having heard recordings of her speaking it. Not terrible, but I wouldn't say she's flawless. Neither am I. So she's an interior designer in London on the strength of, I suppose, that fine art course. So it had to be very well presented. And she was always punctual. And the thing is, she said she would obviously give people an estimate or they'd have to pay up front. But if she'd overestimated her cost, she'd actually refunded people the difference, and that blew people away. So that's why she thrived in business. Anyway, in her late 20s, she married this old Etonian banker called Ed Stowbridge, but after some years, the marriage was annulled. Incidentally, she's brought up in the Catholic version of Christianity, like almost everybody in Austria in her day. But after some years, the marriage was annulled, as in they went to the Pope, and for some reason, the Pope said, okay, this marriage is as it never existed. It is a nullity. Why? The grounds for an annulment are limited. It could be consanguinity. They suddenly discover that they were blood relatives without realizing it. It could be you discover that one of them was already married, so bigamy. It could be that one of them was incapable of having children, hadn't informed the other, or didn't want children, hadn't informed the other. Quite limited grounds on non-consummation that they never did. So the grounds for her annulment were never disclosed. Annulments are extraordinarily rare. It's not to do with behavior. Annulment is not divorce. Divorce is saying, yes, you were married, but that marriage is now over. Divorce is on the grounds of adultery, bestiality, cruelty, abandonment, irreconcilable differences. Could be any of these, depending on the jurisdiction. Annulment is could be a religious statement, but it can have legal effects in some, countries often accept annulment. A secular state could have annulment, or one of the parties was mentally ill at the time, married under duress. One of the parties turned out to be underage at the time, something of that nature. So it all seems to be very affluent and well-connected people manage to secure annulments, not your ordinary Joe. So some people say this is a get out of the rich free card. The Roman Catholic Church will always bend over backwards to accommodate the super rich and the politically powerful. So it seems a bit unfair that ordinary people aren't allowed to get out of their marriages. And so she chose to be discreet about that and not to disclose the reason for the annulment of her first marriage. She had no children from that marriage, because by this time she'd met Prince Michael of Kent. So, who is Prince Michael? We'll go back to King George V. He had 5 sons and 1 daughter. One of his sons, Prince John, died in 1919, that January, at the age of 14. He was mentally subnormal. And so that leaving the 4 sons. Now, the youngest of those sons was named George, and he became the Duke of Kent. That's not King George VI. King George VI was the second of the sons. King George VI was known as Bertie within the family, as in Albert. We're talking about the fourth of the 5 sons. The 5th son was Prince John, who died as a teenager. So, anyway, so that Duke of Kent, he was the bloke who was married to Princess Marina of Yugoslavia. He was a very tall chap, 6'3". Supposedly liked cross-dressing. They say he was bisexual. He was once arrested in Soho, dressed as a woman, but let out when the police realised who it was. But anyway, that Duke of Kent, he was killed in an air crash in May 1942. The only member of the British royal family to be killed in the Second World War. Flying from Scotland to Iceland, from there possibly to the United States. Was it for consultations with President Roosevelt? We don't know. Some of the things related to the Rudolf Hess mystery. Rudolf Hess, was he on that plane? Was he killed? There were the complement of the plane was 18 people. Okay, the plane crashed shortly after takeoff. A rescue crew went up the mountain because the plane had slapped into the side of a mountain. Are there any survivors? They recovered 18 corpses, 18 on the complement list, 18 dead. That's that. Hours later, a very badly wounded and dazed man stumbled into a local cottage, a survivor from the crash. There were 19 people on the plane, but only 18 were listed. Who's the unaccounted member for? We know the Duke of Kent was on that plane, and we know who was killed. His body was identified for various reasons, and he was buried. The court went into mourning, but not for too long. The House of Windsor thought it wouldn't do to be seen to be grieving too much when so many other families were going through such sorrow. So anyway, that Duke of Kent, he had 2 sons, and the eldest one is the current Duke of Kent. The younger one is Michael. Okay, so he was born in, oh my goodness, I can't remember. He's a bit 1940, if I got that right. His father died in 1942. He's the one who wears a beard, who bears a striking resemblance to his distant cousin, Tsar Nikolai II, the last Tsar of all the Russias. So he went to Eton and I think Oxford. I think he served in the Guards and blah, blah, blah. So he's got an intense interest in Russia and he speaks good Russian. So 1978, she married Prince Michael of Kent. Okay, so he's the Queen's first cousin. He's a grandson of King George V. What else about him? So now the reason that she is known, his wife is said as Princess Michael of Kent, is because she's not born a princess. She's a princess by marriage. She's not known as Princess Maria, not by her own name. She's known by her husband's name, if you're going to do it right. Like Kate Middleton would be Princess William, not Princess Kate. But in these modern times, people don't stick to protocol really, and they kind of gone with it. A bit like Princess Meghan. Strictly speaking, she's Princess Henry, because her husband Harry is actually Henry, not Harry. But all right, we're more informal and we just go with the times. People are using the lady's actual Christian name after her title. So that's Princess Michael of Kent. And some people have dubbed her Princess Pushy, saying that she's self-regarding, she's a social climber, blah, blah, blah. She came from a minor aristocratic family in Austria, and she was very eager to marry above her. I have no idea. Maybe she was. Maybe she had this vaulting social ambition. But she was moving in London high society because she was doing interior design. She's obviously into aesthetics, very ladylike. So she looks very youthful, actually, considering she's, my goodness, well, 74. Anyway, she was then told that it wouldn't do for a member of the royal household to be in trade. You can't be buying and selling things. That's unseemly. So that's beneath her status. But she said, well, we don't get a civil list. Okay, so the civil list is all this money that's given to the Queen for disbursement to various members of the royal family in return for public duties, being patrons of charities, being a colonel-in-chief of a regiment, that's an honorary position, they don't actually command the regiment, cutting the ribbon at a new hospital ward, visiting schools, going on diplomatic trips. Her husband goes abroad a lot, particularly to Russia. Anyway, and they were slagged off because they did things such as opening a Little Chef. Little Chef was a sort of like almost junk food, fast food place that were big in the 80s, but they went bust. But all right, they were not too grand. It was not beneath their status to do that, to interact with the public, to fly the flag for the royal family. Anyway, so she said, well, that's not been unfair because we're not living off public money. Well, that's true, but they do have a grace and favour apartment at Kensington Palace. Kensington Palace in London, that was one of the royal family's principal residences till 1837 when Queen Victoria grew up there. But after that, she spent most of her time in Buckingham Palace. So she promised her cousins they would have these apartments for free for life. And that's where she lives, as indeed does Kate Middleton, Princess Diana, various other people. So they were neighbours. And anyway, I'm not sure if they get any other financial advantages, but they're not poor, let's put it like that. So why is commerce prohibited? Well, do you have to sully your hands a little bit, arguably, be less than honest? Are you keeping your wages too high? Are you profiting too much? Are you overpriced? You could argue all that. And so I spoke to her mother about that and saying, well, all right, if you can't do business, you can write books. No one can object to that, making money from that. And so she's written various historical novels, if I got that right. And does it not help a little bit if you got Her Royal Highness before your name when you're an authoress? She's got two children. Lord Frederick is the older one, same age as me. Then they've got a daughter who's 2 years younger, who went to one of the American universities, I can't remember. And her son, Lord Frederick, he's in the year ahead of me, Magdalen College, Oxford, read classics. And then I thought he worked for some city law firm or bank or something like that. He moved to California. He looks very like Prince Eddie, as in Queen Victoria's eldest grandson, as an elder brother of King George V. Prince Eddie died age 27 of pneumonia. But anyway, I remember when I was at school, there was the Amadeus or the Mozart, that play, and he played the Austrian emperor. I can't remember who it was. Was it Franz Josef, the late 18th century one? And I said he was a moronic monarch and he's got a Habsburg pedigree. And Lord Frederick Windsor was not happy with that review. Thought it was a bit cheeky. But actually, I don't think he is related to the Habsburgs. It could be wrong about that. So what else was I going to say about all of them? Now, Princess Michael, she's in the United States in the 80s. She allegedly was overheard in a restaurant loudly making anti-black remarks and coming out the anti-Irish epithets. I don't know if that's true or not. So she says that she has been unfairly castigated by the London press. She gave an interview to Lord Black of Cross Harbour about this. Conrad Black, he's the Canadian-British business mogul who inherited the Toronto Globe and Mail, went to Upper Canada College, and he was later proprietor of the Daily Telegraph, the United Kingdom's major pro-conservative newspaper. He no longer owns it, the Tory Graph it was known as. But Lord Black, he was ennobled because William Hague, when he was leader of the Conservative Party, he proposed Conrad Black for a peerage, and indeed it was done. They share these things out. Okay, Labour nominates some peers, Conservatives nominate some peers. He was the main pro-conservative voice on Fleet Street. Now, Fleet Street is an actual street in London where many British newspapers were based. So it's synonymous with the print media in the UK. But in the 80s, most of them moved out to Wapping and elsewhere. Fleet Street was too cramped. But even though I don't think any newspapers are based in Fleet Street anymore, we still say Fleet Street. It just means newspapers in the United Kingdom. But anyway, Lord Black, he later went to prison in the United States for wire fraud. I don't think he's had his peerage degraded, actually. So he's still Lord Black, if I got that right. Princess Michael, she was about 10 years ago, she was in the United States, where she was filmed walking around New York, if I got that right, hand in hand with a man, not her husband or any sort of relative. Now, does this show a lack of, does it show veridity or perhaps a lack of judgment? and it was put to her that there was some impropriety here. She said, absolutely not having an affair, but I come from Austria and it's completely normal to hold hands with your friend, even if you're the opposite sex. Is she naive? Perhaps. And she said things like that when Prince Harry got his bum smacked in 2004 going to that New Year's Eve party, foreign and colonial being the theme, and dressing up in a Afrika Korps uniform, complete with a swastika armband. She said the kerfuffle about it was overblown. Well, I agree. I mean, you've got a license to make a tit of yourself at a New Year's party when it's fancy dress. You're trying to be a fool, and it was just tomfoolery. It wasn't accepted at that. I mean, he's not expressing any Nazism. It's really lampooning them. People said he shouldn't be allowed to go to Sandhurst, the Royal Military Academy, shouldn't be allowed to be training to be an officer in the British Army because of his stupidity, his offensive behaviour in the run up to Holocaust Memorial Day. But anyway, after he got a bit of a slacking in the media, he got over that. But he's still obviously maybe a little bit touchy. It wasn't a very woke moment. I'm sure Meghan, who's really the queen of his heart, wouldn't let him get away with such antics. So, and as Her Royal Highness said, had His Royal Highness Prince Harry worn a hammer and sickle, nobody would have objected, despite it being representing a system which was just as savage, and that's true. So that's who she is. That's why she's quite well known. She's not in the press very much these days. She says she's too old, and the press corps has moved on to younger victims. And I suppose that's true. That's one thing about Prince Harry is in 10 years' time, Prince William's children, they'll be teenagers, and there'll be a lot more media focus on them that have their independent voice. So if you want to draw the media spotlight to certain causes, they've got to do it now before they fade from public view. So she was a lot more talked about in the 80s. Her Royal Highness Princess Michael of Kent. Why of Kent? Because her father-in-law, he was a Duke of Kent. She never met a father-in-law. He died in 1942. So that's who she is. So she still practices Catholicism, and her husband, he was not very high up on the line of succession when they married in 1978. He would have been about the 10th by then. But obviously he's dropped out. He dropped out of the royal succession, well, because in those days, the active succession said that anyone who married a Roman Catholic was thereby automatically disbarred from the throne, and their children are brought up as Anglicans, baptized and confirmed in the Church of England. But she said her husband is very equitable, and they hear mass, Catholic mass, every other week. So that is Princess Michael of Kent, who she is, why she's somewhat unpopular. She's disputed some of the utterances which have been attributed to her. And anybody can accuse you of having said anything. Perhaps she said something, but it was really overblown and misreported. That false words are attributed to her, or indeed quoted out of context. So, not my favourite person, not a terrible person, but certainly always very well turned out. Tried to steer clear of political controversy, unlike Her Royal Highness Princess Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. So that's my take on Princess Michael of Kent. Not a terrible person, shown her face for charity occasionally, just typical like that. Obviously, brainy, got a few achievements to her belt, under her belt, all those books she's published. That's her. Goodbye. So please remember to subscribe. Please support me on Patreon. I need donations on Patreon to sustain this channel, or indeed, even better, on PayPal, georgecallahan79@gmail.com. Okay, all small letters. GeorgeCallahan 79